Hi, this is Agony Myers, and you are watching Agony Does Not Perform. It has taken me a while to finally get around to watching Get Out, even after buying it. I did buy the movie before watching it because I've heard great reviews about it from all kinds of horror outlets, and all of those gave me a vague understanding of the premise. However, it wasn't until watching it that I was able to get what the movie was actually doing. Initially, I gained the general understanding that it was a social commentary about race with some sort of hypnosis and brainwashing that made black characters subservient to white characters, but I was unaware of how similar it would be to Stepford Wives, which came out in 1975. With that in mind, rather than just reviewing Get Out, I'm going to compare it to Stepford Wives because they are both horror movies that make social commentaries, with one obviously being about race and another one obviously being about gender. And also, I kind of want to use these two comparisons to kind of generate a formula for what, like a queer-themed horror social commentary would look like. So let's get into it. First, let me talk about Stepford Wives. So the general premise of Stepford Wives provides social commentary about traditional gender roles by having people move to a suburban, Leave It to Beaver-esque town where the women are all perfect 1950s housewives who were essentially animatronic domesticated sex robots who were designed by their husbands. The restoration of traditional gender roles in the town eerily brought back a recent and oppressive past to audiences in the 70s, since the previous decade was full of social and sexual political movements that aimed to liberate women. For example, in 1963, Betty Friedan published her best-selling book, The Feminine Mystique, which addressed how suburban housewives who've been told that they have it all faced utter boredom and lack of fulfillment. Even though these women had the niceties and of nice houses, lovely children, and responsible husbands, domesticity was essentially killing their individuality and independence. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1965 gave women access to jobs and employers with long histories of discrimination were required to provide timetables for increasing the number of women in their workplaces. Divorce laws were liberalized, employers were barred from firing pregnant women, and women's studies programs were created in colleges and universities. Record numbers of women ran for and started winning political office. In 1972, Congress passed Title IX of the Higher Education Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program receiving federal funds, and thereby forced all male schools to open their doors to women and athletic programs to sponsor and finance female sports teams. In 1973, in its controversial ruling on Roe v. Wade, the United States Supreme Court legalized abortion, which gave women the opportunity to, not let a pregnancy basically dictate the next 18 years or so of their lives. So the horror of Stepford Wives came from its allusion to men's desire to return to the oppressive world of the 1950s that kept women powerless and subservient, while men were in complete control. In order to do this, the men in the movie isolated their wives from the rest of the country that was quickly progressing, killing them and replacing them with robots that were designed to be the perfectly domestic housewives of the 1950s. These replacements were exactly the type of women that Friedan addressed in her book, but without the intelligent or complicated thoughts that would make them realize that they were in a form of captivity or capable of more than just a life of domesticity. So this brings me to 2016 and Get Out. Like Stepford Wives, Get Out makes a similar commentary about race. Instead of being about men trying to dominate women, the movie is about white people trying to dominate black people. Instead of killing black characters and replacing them with empty-headed, subservient robots, the white people in Get Out kidnap or lure in black people, subdue them with hypnosis, and older white people take over their bodies to live longer and keep racial minorities under their control. Unlike how Stepford Wives came out fresh after women's rights movements, Get Out came out 5 decades after the major civil rights movements that also took place in the 60s, and about 150 years after the United States abolished chattel slavery in 1865. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act was implemented to prohibit voter suppression against black people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed to prevent employers from discriminating new employees based on race, gender, color, religion, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed to prohibit the use of literacy tests as gatekeepers that prevented blacks and the lower classes from being qualified to vote. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was signed to provide equal housing opportunities to people of various races, religions, and national origins. Various peaceful protests took place throughout these years to fight racial segregation, which influenced these legislations. Even though these actions gave racial minorities better opportunities, they couldn't solve all of the racial tensions that were bubbling up beneath the surface. In fact, a lot of this legislation appeared to make non-racial minorities think that these laws have made everything right between blacks and whites, regardless of the inherent prejudice that still existed. Therefore, this overlooking of systemic racism, like how black people are the primary targets and suspects of law enforcement, and how drugs like crack that are more likely to be consumed by black and poor people became more criminalized than cocaine, its expensive white cousin, leading to prisons primarily consisting of racial minorities, created a lot more tension between the races from the 1970s to the 2000s. Since non-blacks were seemingly oblivious to systemic racism and these underlying tensions, whenever they were brought to white people's attention, they would assume that blacks were just whining about slavery and other things that happened decades ago, which made them defensive about race issues, since what has already taken place is out of their control, and this burden continues to be placed on them since they are still the majority. Here, I don't mean majority in the sense that there are more white people than non-white people, but white people are still the ones in charge and who are part of the status quo, while people of other races aren't. Right before Get Out's release, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged online in 2013 to protest George Zimmerman's acquittal after shooting and killing black teenager Trayvon Martin in 2012 out of an unwarranted suspicion towards Martin. In the following years, Black Lives Matter gained more of a presence by demonstrating in the streets to shine light on the fact that American culture seems okay with white people in general and their police forces attacking unarmed black men. So even though Get Out didn't immediately follow other major civil rights movements the way that Stepford Wives did, it immediately followed Black Lives Matter and addresses a more hidden modern racism while alluding to the seemingly ancient horror of slavery. Even though Get Out alludes to slavery by having affluent white people in a small town using young black people as their servants, buying and auctioning them, having them dress like old-timey slaves, while ultimately controlling them, the movie gets at modern racism that the Trump era has blown wide open. Since people's attempt to combat racism has been to outwardly police political correctness, people have not only started revolting against sensitive snowflakes or social justice warriors, but became better at hiding their prejudices against racial, sexual, ethnic, and gender minorities. since instead of going back in time to slavery or the civil rights era, Jordan Peele brought Get Out to the modern day when liberal whites are woke and interracial couples are considered normal, but there was obviously something bad happening beneath the surface. Just like systemic racism, everything seemed fine and normal to all the white people in the movie, but Chris and Rod were able to tell that something was wrong and that Chris was in danger. So all of this brings me to kind of theorizing what some kind of horror, queer social commentary movie would look like. I know there has been, by this point, there has been several kind of gay references to Get Out. I mean, RuPaul's Drag Race had a challenge where people were basically starring in a movie that was like a drag queen version of Get Out. And I know that tense scene between the gay millennial and all the other older gays at a dinner party in Tales of the City. There was kind of a reference to Get Out with that.
How about not leaving me totally alone after inviting me to the fucking gay version of Get Out?
But yeah, it's like, I mean, but kind of seriously speaking, it's like I would like to kind of go through my idea for what an actual queer horror commentary would actually look like if, film creators ever got to that point. So, an idea that came to mind once I thought of this comparison was the fact that there aren't any social horror commentaries about queerness. I mean, there's subtle hints to queerness, like for example, in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 2, there's a lot of queer subtext that people kind of apply to and read into it. But I mean, the fact that most of the creators of that movie were totally oblivious to it being remotely gay or queer or anything like that kind of says something. I mean, because it's not directly approaching queerness and queer issues and specific fears that queer people face, similar to specific fears that, women might face with losing their autonomy, or black people might face with, having to be faced with like racism and white supremacy again. There aren't any social horror commentaries about queerness. I mean, yes, queerness has had a presence in horror culture through most 80s vampire movies that alluded to the AIDS epidemic and expressed sexual fluidity. But nothing has given as significant a commentary about how queerness is socially situated in mainstream society, the way that Get Out and Stepford Wives sort of accomplished that. So for a little background, when I was in high school, my one close friend and I came out to each other. Once our odd interests and non-normative sexualities and gender identities became known, I got really attached to him because he was the only person I was able to relate to at the time, and was terrified of the outside world that could have gay bashed me or tried sending me to gay correctional therapy by shoving Jesus down my throat. In fact, I became so dependent on him and his queer influence, I began thinking that if anything separated us, we might not be strong enough to fend for ourselves if our families or other forces tried beating or preying the gay out of us. It came up a few times that his mom was thinking of moving to a different city, and that fear of mine entered my mind. I began imagining my one friend leaving only to return to visit on distant occasions and witnessing a change that he was subjected to without my queer influence. I somehow imagined my very queer friend who wore makeup and weird contacts, frequently dyed his hair, and dressed femininely, turning straight and normal without me by looking normal, and his face going blank whenever I mentioned something about drag or cute guys I was crushing on. I was not only scared of losing my friend, but a major influence in my queer identity. So if he had somehow been brainwashed out of his queerness, what chance did I have with this new identity I had just discovered for myself that has liberated me? So even though this idea was conceived by an irrational teenager who didn't know a lot about the world or how my family would take my queerness, It highlights real anxieties for queer people of any age. Even if our families are accepting of us, they are the major heterosexual influences in our lives, which means that most of our influences about how to be queer exist outside from our biological families. As teenagers, we are still vulnerable to the harms that our families and peers at school could inflict on us for being queer. If our families are true blue Jesus freaks, we can be subjected to outright attacks from the people we are supposed to trust, and those attacks are likely to go unpunished because of systemic homophobia and how much power the Judeo-Christian influence has in this country. My grasp on my identity is a lot stronger today, but that doesn't mean that my fear as a teenager is no longer relevant. To this day, only about 16 out of America's 50 states have completely banned conversion therapy, which is pitifully less than half of the country. In Jose Esteban Munoz's book, Disidentifications, Queers of Color, and the Performance of Politics, he discusses two documentaries by Susanna Aiken and Carlos Aparicio that starts with The Salt Mines, which came out in 1990, which almost serves as a counter to Paris's Burning because it takes a darker tone than the Livingston documentary by showing the lives of homeless trans women who deal drugs and prostitute for a living in New York City during the late 80s, and follows up with The Transformation, which came out in 1996, which is a documentary about one of the trans women from the salt mines, Sarah, with her accepting Christianity and attempting to live as a recovered heterosexual man, Ricardo. I have not seen either of these documentaries because they're fairly obscure and hard to find. Trust me, I've tried looking to no avail. But Munoz gives a fairly good explanation of them. Munoz writes that Paris's Burning presented a highly sensationalized rendering of Latino and Black transvestite and transsexual communities. The Salt Mines and The Transformation, two texts that have received far less critical consideration, have offered a narration of transgender communities of color in New York City that has resisted the impulse to glamorize the experience and their experience in the way that Paris's Burning does. They offer a much starker and less glamorous rendering of the minoritarian subject, specifically Latino transsexuals. The salt mines of the video's title is taken from the name given by its inhabitants to the parking lot of a New York City salt reserve that had been converted into a makeshift transgender village. The video depicts the queens cooking hamburgers over a campfire, shooting up female hormones, and reading each other. Many of the salt mines population are on crack, and a large number are sex workers. Beyond these activities, the queens of the salt mines do quite a bit of talking. One of the best talkers is one of the video's most engaging subjects, Sarah. Sarah is a transgendered subject who was born male and has been shooting female hormones over the course of many years. Sarah and the other queens of the salt mines are preyed on by missionaries who are interested in winning their souls. The queens are highly skeptical of these mostly white evangelists whose notion of salvation is decidedly anti-queer and homophobic. The transformation begins with a letter sent to Aiken and Aparicio by Sarah, who now, 4 years after the events depicted in the salt mines, has relocated to Texas and is going by the name Ricardo. Ricardo is Sarah's male birth name. He has taken on this name in the same fashion that he has taken on a heterosexual identification and a conversion to fundamentalist Christianity. Ricardo has even gone as far as to marry a woman from his church group. Even though Sarah had breasts and had undergone years of guerrilla hormone therapy, he is trying to masculinize himself to fit into his new community. This masculinization includes having his implants removed, cutting his hair, and renouncing his homosexual desire. It is not difficult to understand why Ricardo has made this transformation. The chief reason is his health status. Ricardo is living with AIDS. His already tragically shortened lifespan would have been even more painful if he had continued to live on the street in poverty and malnourished. His choice to leave the street for the relative warmth and comfort of the materially supportive church community is an act of survival. Ricardo worked with and on the ideology of born-again Christianity, attempting to benefit from its rewards, such as material support, supportive communities, and companionship, while resisting total co-optation by that discourse. The cost of Ricardo's transformation was his breasts, his homosexual desire, and his queerness. He tried his best to perform normative heterosexuality. The interviews with his wife and other members of the Texas community indicated that he had made serious inroads. He was accepted and nurtured, yet at what cost? It is clear that Ricardo compromised a great deal to reformulate his identity into a form that was legible to and compatible with born-again Christianity. The video ends with a chilling monologue in which a tired and infirm Ricardo seems especially bitter and sad. His final wish is not to appear ridiculous to others in his illness. He admits that he never successfully negotiated his desire, that he missed the touch of other men tremendously. This last monologue was recorded shortly before his death. The viewer cannot help but feel the stinging sadness of Ricardo's life. Compromising his self to the dominant ideology cost too much. Ricardo's church knew of the previous documentary and Sarah's role in it and attempted to use the video artists Aiken and Aparicio to spread Ricardo's message/example in a new documentary. Aiken and Aparicio took the church and Ricardo's bait, yet clearly had no intentions of being reeled in. Instead of chronicling the triumph and salvation of Ricardo's new life, they recorded the way in which he failed to convert his fellow Salt Mines alumni, the difficulties of his marriage, his persistent yet stifled desire for other men, and the sadness of his death. Ricardo disidentified with the church that used him, the Salt Mines community, and his own desire as a man who desired other men. He attempted to refashion himself in an attempt to negotiate a homophobic public sphere and a world of poverty that would accelerate his illness. This quote-unquote recovery story seems to show how bigoted Christians or family members sometimes try to force their own image of other people onto those like Sarah, who are isolated and vulnerable even when they don't cleanly fit into this community. They appear to be in some sort of denial about the fact that these outsiders don't really pass as cisgendered or heterosexual when they're being forced to pass, but still prefer the suppressed versions of these people. The worst thing about these kinds of stories is that the homophobes get to have a chip on their shoulders by believing that they have successfully converted queer people into a heteronormative version of themselves by the grace of God, but mostly by coercion, which often leads to these people's eventual suicides. When I had first read Munoz's details about the transformation, I was glad that I was alone at my office because I couldn't fight back the tears that welled up in my eyes and trickled down my face. The fact that Sarah would have most likely died in the streets of New York if she didn't allow these Christians in Texas essentially get to and brainwash her struck a painful chord deep inside of me. Even though I didn't actually see Ricardo or Sarah's awkward attempt to pass as a recovered cisgender heterosexual man in the documentary, I was able to imagine a desperate person's attempt to suppress her queer desire and butch it up to please the people whose love and support for her is highly conditional. My image of Ricardo isn't that different from what I imagined my friend becoming if he had moved away and somehow turned straight, or even the robot housewives in Stepford Wives, and possessed black people in Get Out. All of these appear to be subservient, empty shells of human beings that are here to be whatever a dominant force wants them to be, with the qualities that made them different either taken away or hidden. These dominant forces all typically want ultimate control and to only do things in the world that benefit them, and don't want anything else getting in the way of or challenging them. So just kind of summing everything up, this is how I think that a horror social commentary movie about queerness can be structured to make an impact. By borrowing some things from Stepford Wives, Get Out, and even Invasion of the Body Snatchers, some really good filmmakers can make a chilling movie about a community turning queer people heteronormative. Since these kinds of horrors usually cut fairly deep into the immediate family's influence and religion, this movie could address how some people tend to choose oppressive Christian morality over ethics of decent humanity and actually protecting their families. It could get into how standards of what is and isn't gay these days is arbitrarily difficult to decipher, which would make the correctional therapy just wipe people's personalities clean like a restored hard drive. And like the transformation, it can show how bigoted people either seem to ignore the awkward performance of queer people trying to act straight, or at least prefer that over queer people actually being themselves, which could make audiences ponder if everybody has been brainwashed or are just that committed to their own bullshit. Maybe a movie like this could really wake people up who haven't considered how toxic homophobia and blind religious faith can be, as well as how far we still have to go as a nation in terms of civil rights issues. So, in case you couldn't tell from how I look, basically from the waist up, as I've been kind of yammering on and talking to you, my look is kind of trying to look housewife, Stepford wife-esque, just considering the context of this video. It's very matronly, it's very, very kind of almost like I feel like one of the white women from The Help, but maybe a little bit skinkier and hairier and everything like that. But yeah, it's like, this is about as fishy as I get. I kind of wish I had an apron to kind of wear over my skirt, just to kind of seal in that 50s housewife femininity. Also, I have worn this dress in the Me Search video for a brief portion of that after I did my makeup and everything like that, so please don't clock me on re-wearing something. I just felt like this was really appropriate for the occasion, and I like trying to dress kind of, along with the theme that I'm doing. Also, as a little side note, I would like to, take a little time to kind of talk about, I guess, the production quality of my video right now, in case you haven't noticed how soft and beautiful this light makes my face look, and everything else, because I, as I said in one of my previous videos, I recently moved, so I've been just kind of getting things settled with that, and I basically have my own room basically for my drag and different horror accoutrements and stuff like that, and just got a nice little vanity for my makeup, and as well as, as a desk to do my videos and everything like that. And, I bought a simple little lighting kit that kind of, that's helping make me look a little bit more pretty, because I don't have a lot of money for, good quality camera equipment and everything like that. But lighting makes a world of difference and everything. So yeah, I'm kind of getting there. So hopefully, my next videos that I make will be much better quality, and, I'll look a little bit prettier. I think from hearing me yammer on about these movies and one of my ultimate fears as a kid, you can probably guess that one of my ultimate fears are things like oppressive, dominant forces gradually taking over unsuspecting people through brainwashing or other doppelganger-like conspiracies. Even though I recently just saw it, the premise of They Live kind of relates to that, as well as, Invasion of the Body Snatchers and other types of stories like that. I remember when I first watched the first season of Stranger Things, the thing that scared me the most was just the whole weird conspiracy cover-up thing that Hawkins' lab was doing, as far as, you know, like making a fake body like of Will just to make, you know, people stop looking for him and everything like that. Like, I remember, you know, just the scene when Hopper cuts his body open and sees that it was a dummy. Like, I remember that, like, terrifying me more than, like, anything else going on, just because I just have a huge fear of, like, being lied to and, you know, being the subject of some, you know, greater conspiracy kind of going on and things like that, and just that overall deception. So yeah, feel free to comment about what your ultimate fears are, or how you like horror movies that make some kind of socio-political commentary. And as usual, like, comment, and subscribe. And tell your friends and your mother and your dog and just everybody about my little page, because I would definitely like to have more subscribers and more interaction. And, you know, maybe I could start having people request topics for me to do and everything like that. So yeah, without further ado, I guess I will bid you adieu. And yeah, bye.